Hello, I'm Mr. Wilkinson, and this is Biological. We've been talking about introductions of biology. A couple of videos ago, we talked about the characteristics of life, and last video we talked about the levels of organization. In this video, we're going to cover biomolecules, the things that make up you. You should have some kind of paper with you, then be writing along with me as we go through this. It'll help you remember the things we talk about. We'll start with our topic at the top, biomolecules. Biomolecules. Bio, of course, you'll remember, means life, and a molecule is a group of atoms that are chemically bonded with one another. So biomolecules are found in living things. These are the macromolecules that are found in all living things. And there are four biomolecules. You probably heard of one of these, carbohydrates. You probably have heard it called carbs. A lot of people on diets like to talk about carbs and what kind of carbs and how many carbs they are eating. Carbohydrates have a very, very important function to cells, to living things, and that is they provide energy. They're giving us energy to run on. Okay? Carbohydrates provide energy for your cells. Some examples are sugar, bread, pasta, rice, and a molecule I want you to remember called glucose. Okay? If you were to look at these carbohydrates chemically, they look like hexagons. They look like little hexagons. Now, we're skipping a lot of the chemistry because this is an introductory biology course. And so if you want to go look these up, you'll see very complex chemical molecules and models. But for this recording, for this lesson, we're just going to think about them as hexagons, okay? Now, if you have just one carbohydrate, one sugar molecule, or one glucose molecule, we call that a monosaccharide. Monosaccharide. A very long and complex name. So mono just means one, and saccharide means sugar. Okay, so we have one sugar. We have got one sugar molecule. Now I said biomolecules are macromolecules. And macromolecules are a bunch of small molecules all put together in a row. So if we were to have a bunch of these monosaccharides bonded together to form a chain of monosaccharides, they would no longer be called monosaccharides. At that point, we'd have many of them, and we'd call them polysaccharides. Polysaccharide. So carbohydrates provide us energy. If you have just one of them, we call it a monosaccharide. And if you have them bonded all together, we call it a polysaccharide. These are big words, and it can be difficult to remember which one goes with which. So just remember the car ride. Car ride. So carbohydrates, monosaccharide. And if you have more than one, then it's a polysaccharide. Poly means many. So that's one group of biomolecules is carbohydrates. So we can box this up to keep it separate from the rest of our notes. The next group that we're going to talk about are lipids. Lipids, okay? Lipids are also called fats and oils and waxes. Lipids are interesting biomolecule because they're not grouped together based on their chemical structure per se, but they're grouped together because they are non-polar, which means they don't like water. Okay? They are hydrophobic. In our next video, we'll talk more about water and the different properties and what that really means. So if you're not really sure, just hang on and watch the next video. So lipids, fats, waxes, and oils don't really have one common monomer for all of them because they're any kind of biomolecule that's nonpolar. However, a lot of them are still made up of these long chains of carbons, which kind of look like zigzag lines, called fatty acids. Okay, a fatty acid. You can group a bunch of fatty acids together, connecting them with a glycerol to get a triglyceride. So you can see all of those fatty acids there. Or for the case of our membranes, you can group them together with a phosphate group and get a phospholipid. Okay, so this here is a triglyceride, and this here is a phospholipid. Now again, these are not the actual chemical structures, they're simplifications of those. For basic biology, introductory biology, you don't need to know their chemical structures, but it is helpful to think about them. So we talked about how carbohydrates are useful for energy, quick energy. You give a little kid a bunch of candy, they go crazy. They get all kinds of energy. But if we eat a bunch of food over a long period of time, we'll end up getting fat. Lipids, their function is to store energy. They store energy. They lock it away. So we'll draw a little padlock around our energy to remember that lipids store energy. The other thing that lipids do is they make cell membranes. Cell membranes. So if we draw ourselves a little cell, just a circle with a circle inside of it, we'll have a little animal cell here. The cell membrane is what's on the edge of that cell, on the outside of the cell. Okay? So lipids store energy and they make cell membranes. The next group that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to go to a new page for this one. You can keep going down on your page, or you can go with it to a new page with me. The next group is proteins. Proteins. Okay? Proteins are very interesting molecules because they can take all kinds of different shapes. They're able to do this because they're made of 20 different kinds of things. So they've got 20 different pieces that you can make a protein with. Proteins have many functions. They have many shapes, and thus many functions. Many shapes, many functions. The form determines the function. Have you ever tried to cut a piece of wood in half with a curling iron? Have you ever tried to curl your hair with a saw? Probably not. Because each of those things have a particular shape that helps them do their function. So it is with proteins. The different particular shapes that proteins take allow them to have their specialized functions. So a protein has many shapes and many functions, but they fall into 4 different categories. They can hold things in place, they move things around, they build molecules, and they break molecules. So even though they have many different specialized functions, we can think about them in 4 different groups. And there's a hand motion that you can use to help you remember this. They hold, move, build, and break. They hold, move, build, and break. All proteins will have one of those functions, or I should say most proteins are going to have some version of those. Proteins are made of monomers called amino acids. And for the sake of this video, we're just going to draw a little circle for our amino acid. Amino acids. So amino acids are also called a peptide. A peptide. If we group all of these amino acids together in a long chain, and remember, each of these amino acids can be different, which means we can have very, very unique chains of amino acids, or chains of peptides, called a polypeptide. Now what's interesting about these molecules is that once we have these chains of polypeptides, they can form different structures. They can form spirals called alpha helixes. They can form flat areas called beta sheets. And then these alpha helices and beta sheets can interact with another to make another layer of structure. And then these different proteins can react with each other, making complex shapes that all interact with each other. Now I'm really just kind of drawing squiggles, and you can draw this with me if you like. So we have 3 different layers of structure. We have primary, which is just the order of peptides. We have the secondary, which is these alpha helices and beta sheets. We have tertiary, which is how these different alpha helices and beta sheets interact with each other. And then we have quaternary, which is how these different tertiary structures interact with each other. So all of these layers of structures allow proteins to take all kinds of different shapes and have a variety of functions. So we'll go ahead and box this off in our notes to keep them separate from the rest of our notes. Anytime you can draw for your notes is good. It's a good practice. So there's our proteins. So next we've got one more group of molecules. You may have heard of them before. They're called nucleic acids. You might be thinking, Mr. Wilkinson, I've never heard of nucleic acids. Well, have you ever heard of DNA? DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA. DNA has another molecule it's very similar to called RNA, which is just most of this, but it's without the deoxy. It's the ribonucleic acid, or RNA. So these nucleic acids were originally discovered inside the nucleus of cells. And that's why they're called nucleic acids. You probably know the function of DNA, which looks like a twisted ladder or a double helix, and it stores information. I ran out of space there. It stores information. Ribonucleic acids have lots of different functions where they aid DNA in taking this stored information and using it to make all of these different proteins that we were talking about before. Cells need some way of remembering how to make these complex structures, and nucleic acids allow that to happen. So we've talked about a lot of different things in our discussion of biomolecules. We'll go back to our first page, right? So we talked about carbohydrates. How we can remember their monomers is monosaccharide. We have carbohydrates, so we just go for a car-ride. We will remember that carbohydrates, their main function is energy, short-term energy. You're going to use it immediately. So they have their monomers of monosaccharides. Their polymer is the polysaccharide. We talked about lipids, fats, oils, and waxes. Lipids store energy, and they make up your cell membranes. They don't really have a monomer. We'll go ahead and call them fatty acids for their monomer. These are long chains of carbons. The next group we talked about was proteins. How proteins have many different shapes and many different functions. They can hold, move, build, and break. Their monomers are called amino acids or peptides. We group these together to make polypeptides. Are you seeing a pattern here? We had polysaccharide and now polypeptide. We've got complex structures created by nucleic acids. And you know what? We didn't talk about the monomers of nucleic acids. If we have just one, they kind of look like this. We have just one. They have a phosphate group, a sugar group, and a nitrogenous base. We'll go ahead and label those. Phosphate, sugar, and base. And all three of these things together make a nucleotide. If you group a bunch of nucleotides together, you get, you guessed it, a polynucleotide. So nucleic acids, like DNA and RNA, are made of nucleotides and are polynucleotides. Now we talked about all four of these different biomolecules, and while I said you don't have to figure out their chemical structures yet for this course, there is a special tool you can use to help you remember these, to help you identify their chemical structures. And that is CHO-CHON-CHOMP. CHO, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and lipids are also made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. They always have those three things. Proteins have CHON, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And nucleic acids always have CHOMP with an N, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So if you're looking at these, one thing to remember is that you need an N to spell nucleic acid, and you need an N to spell protein, and they both have nitrogen, because you need nitrogen to make proteins and nucleic acids. You don't need nitrogen to make carbohydrates or lipids, and they don't have N's in their name. That's something to help you remember the chemical structures when you need to identify those later in biochemistry, if you ever get there, or if you just want to look at some of these structures. Now, our body is made up of all 4 of these biomolecules. And you get most of them in your food: carbohydrates and lipids and proteins. You can probably identify some of these things by looking at packages and reading the nutritional information on them. Here's your challenge for today. I want you to write a paragraph describing what kinds of food you can find carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins in. Now, you won't find food with nucleic acids that your body uses because we make all of our nucleic acids from scratch. It helps prevent us from getting infected with viruses and other things like that. So take a moment and write a paragraph about what kind of foods you can find carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins inside.